Good morning. Welcome to the launch announcement of the National AAPI Violence Prevention and Response Initiative. My name is Dion. I'm the Executive Director of the National Compassion Fund. We collect and distribute charitable contributions to victims of mass violence crime. We're joined with representatives of the Georgia Asian Pacific American Bar Association and the Korean American Bar Association of Georgia. They're announcing the creation of two funds to assist victims of hate crimes targeted at the Asian Pacific American community. The National Compassion Fund was created at the request of survivors of violent crime who oftentimes experienced the situation where after a violent crime, people would donate money for the benefit of victims, and sometimes it didn't always go where it was supposed to. We've worked with victims of hate crimes before, and I remember working with survivors of the Pulse nightclub and talking with one survivor and about the process and answering their questions. And we were still in the process of raising money and we had no idea what benefits would be. But I remember telling him, you're going to get some money. I can't tell you how much. But what I do know, and what's maybe even more important than that, is to know that people from all over the country and even around the world reached into their pocket to help because they cared about you. And I think that was even more important when people feel isolated and targeted, to know that they're not alone. Unfortunately, at the National Compassion Fund, every single day we deal with the worst things that human beings can do to one another. But those acts are countered by examples of love, compassion, generosity, and resilience. And those are the things that we focus on. And those are the things that will help the community in Greater Atlanta and the Asian American Pacific Islander community build their resilience to overcome these threats. The National Compassion Fund is based on a premise that 100% of the funds that are donated for victims go to victims. We've managed 14 relief funds for mass casualty crime victims since 2014, and we've distributed over $95 million to more than 3,000 victims. We are able to do this because we have contributors who cover our costs and expenses so that 100% of the funds that are donated for victims can go to victims. And for this fund that we're going to be working with for Atlanta victims, where I want to thank our corporate sponsor of GoFundMe, who's providing a contribution to cover our expenses so that everything donated for victims can go to victims. We have with us today some survivors of other mass casualty crimes who are representatives of Victims First, a network of families and survivors of mass violence who have experienced firsthand what can happen when things don't go well with the relief fund and the benefits that can exist when they do. And they're going to talk to us for a minute about why it's important to have a fund. And they stand here in solidarity with the victims in Atlanta. They've been in their shoes, and we know that those folks aren't ready to talk right now. But it's important that we understand the perspective of those survivors. And so these other survivors from past crimes will share their experience and about why this effort is so important. Joining us, we're going to hear from some of them, but I want to go ahead and let you know some of the other folks from Victims First that are watching. Neil Heslin, who's the father of Jesse Lewis, who was murdered at Sandy Hook Elementary. Javier Nava, who was shot in the abdomen and 4 of his friends were killed on the dance floor at the Pulse nightclub. Joe Samaha's daughter, Rima, was murdered in the Virginia Tech mass shooting, and now he runs VTV Care, providing long-term financial assistance to all mass shooting victims. And we'll hear from Tiara Parker, who was shot multiple times at Pulse nightclub, and her 18-year-old cousin, Akira Murray, died in her arms. Nikki Suzuki's cousin, Micayla Medic, was murdered in the Aurora mass shooting, and her cousin Stacy Suzuki survived the Las Vegas shooting. And we have Caren Teves, whose son Alex saved his girlfriend before being shot and killed in the Aurora theater shooting. Eric Mace is here, and his daughter, Ryanne, was the youngest of 5 murdered in the Cole Hall shooting at Northern Illinois University. And they have a statement from Victims First, and they're going to share with us their experience. Eric, did you want to start?
Thanks, Jeff. We'd like to thank the Georgia Bar Associations for their compassion and transparency. We encourage the public to give directly to the victims through this fund, and we applaud the National Compassion Fund for stepping up once again and ensuring that 100% of your donation will go directly to the victim base. Although there has been another mass shooting recently, we cannot forget the victims of this terrible mass shooting that killed so many in the Asian community. We're here to answer any questions that you have, and we have a couple that we see here now. The first one is, what in your experience caused you to support the creation of the NCF? I'd like to throw it over to Caren Teves first to talk about that, and then I'd like to give my perspective on it as well.
Hello, everyone. Our hearts are heavy for the families in Georgia and Colorado. We know this trauma, and we are greatly saddened that they have joined our new unfortunate family of mass shooting survivors. I'd like to take a moment to talk about why we know that the Compassion Fund is so important. I can tell you stories for hours of why this is so important. We've seen time and time again that money is being raised in the names and using the faces of our loved ones, and the money does not end up with those families, to those families. Excuse me, I have a very loud bird behind me. So that's why the Compassion Fund is so important. They will get the funds directly to the victims. And they do honor donor intent, because donors really have no idea where their money is going, but they do believe it's going to the victims, but it does not.
Thanks, Caren. My involvement came after Ryan's death. I was afforded the time and had the resources to step away from work and focus solely on the early stages of recovery from that shock. This is not the case with many of the other members of the sad fraternity that we all find ourselves in. No one should ever have to deal with this type of shock, let alone deal with becoming financially ruined by it. In the weeks after a tragedy such as Atlanta, people reach out to help the victims in the only way ordinarily afforded to them. They donate money. The donor's primary desire is to directly help those who have experienced tragedy and expect their gift to be used to ease that burden. Many organizations that collect money in the wake of a tragedy, though, do not honor this desire. The National Compassion Fund does by collecting money for a limited period, distributing 100% of it to the victims, and ultimately closing the fund. We also have a question of how has being a past recipient positively impact you? I think Tiara Parker from the Pulse Club is the best one to answer this. Tiara?
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Tiara Parker. I am Pulse nightclub survivor. And I lost my cousin Akira Murray that night. She literally died in my arms, and I was also unaware of that until I got to the hospital. What I could best say about dealing with those funds and meeting with those people who were affiliated with those programs, I would say if it wasn't for those funds, I wouldn't have been able to do half the things I was able to do, such as keeping things afloat at home. My mom had ended up leaving her job. My family, who's my cousin's mother and them, they also end up leaving their jobs because we weren't mentally there to be able to sustain, to constantly keep working. I almost lost my job. They were trying to fire me, and I found that out as well. And had it not been for those funds, I wouldn't have been able to pretty much keep myself afloat, as well as like even when it came down to medical bills, though that Orlando took care of the part that when I was in the hospital there, I still had to come home and do follow-up appointments and still receive medication and more care, mental health, and everything like that. And if it wasn't for that money, I wouldn't have been able to do as such. The funds are very important, and going and it being directly sent to victims is vital, because I can't express enough how heartbreaking it is to see a lot of these funds come about and they, oh, this is for the survivors of this, but they're still struggling mentally, physically, emotionally, everything. It is so important. And if it wasn't, like I said, the National Compassion Fund and One Orlando, all of those that came together really, really made a difference in my life. It changed my life.
Thank you, Tiara. I know, listening to you and talking about how your parents and your cousin's parents had to leave their job, a lot of people don't understand when you lose a child, the trauma that you go through, that it's just hard to focus. And I remember talking with one parent whose daughter was killed, and he's an airline pilot. And he said, I can't focus. And I'm an airline pilot, and if I can't focus, I can't do my job because other people's lives are on the line. And to understand why that the funds that were provided gave them that time to heal. I know that Nikki's on is on. Nikki, unbelievably, your family was linked to two different mass shootings, and there were different responses to those. Can you talk about your family's experience and maybe how they were different in the different situations?
Yeah, so I think at first it's just a lot of shock, because I think it's really easy to get like detached from things you see on the news. But yeah, it was definitely a huge shock. The second time, even more so. Just kind of a strong disappointment. But it's really great to see that there's such a strong community of people stepping up to support other people, like strangers. It's very heartwarming to see. And I also just wanted to echo Eric and Caren and Tiara in thanking the Georgia Bar Associations for establishing the Atlanta 316 Survivors Fund and the AAPI Victim Assistance and Prevention Fund. That's designating clear paths for the public to give directly to the victims of the spa shootings and help other victims of violence in the Asian community. And also the Atlanta 316 Survivors Fund is the first fund for the survivors of the spa shootings in the country, where donations will go directly to the full victim base. These families and survivors will need these funds to heal the way only they know how. And there's a multitude of financial needs for victims after a mass shooting, and these funds will really prove vital, as Tiara has mentioned.
Great. Thank you, Nikki. And I want to thank all our survivor families for your ongoing commitment to the other folks that find themselves joining that club that nobody wants to be a part of. And our survivors are going to stick around and we'll be available for questions afterwards. Now I want to turn to our partners and want to introduce BJay Pak, who is an attorney and a former U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Georgia, who's going to talk to us about the creation of the AAPI Crime Victims in Education Fund. BJay?
Thank you, Jeff. First of all, I want to thank the victims for sharing your personal stories. I know each tragedy is asking you to relive that experience that you went through. Again, I'm BJay Pak. I'm a partner at a law firm here called Alston & Bird. And previously, I served as the 25th presidentially appointed and Senate-confirmed United States Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia, which includes Atlanta. The events of March 16 shocked the entire nation, but in particular, the Asian American community. 8 innocent people, 6 of whom were Asian American, lost their lives in a cold execution-style killing. Well, why did this event impact the Asian American community more deeply? It's because the massacre occurred in the context when hate incidents and violence towards Asian Americans had skyrocketed in the past year, especially during the pandemic. These senseless and random acts of bigotry and violence caused many Asians and Asian Americans to fear living on their everyday lives. While the events of March 16th have garnered tremendous media attention, The truth is, the vast majority of Asian victims of hate or bias-motivated violent crimes don't get the attention nor get the support that they need and that they will need going forward. For example, while I was U.S. Attorney, our office prosecuted a case where a violent robbing crew targeted 9 Asian-owned businesses and pistol whipped several people and shot 3, including one Asian woman who was cowering in fear, right in the back. The investigation revealed that the perpetrator targeted Asian business owners because they believed in the stereotype that Asian business owners carried a large amount of cash and would be submissive and would not fight back. Although this may not have been a hate crime as defined by federal law, it's very true that it was a hate or bias-motivated crime based on a false stereotype. Of course, the Asian victim that was shot in the back needed a significant amount of medical procedures and assistance, so she easily exhausted the victim assistance benefits that the government could provide and needed substantially more for ongoing medical bills and other needs. The community wanted to fundraise to help her, but the victim was hesitant to publicize her own story for multiple reasons, well, mainly because of the cultural reasons. Sadly, these types of stories are not isolated. There are many victims of hate and bias-motivated violent crimes that do not get the attention and the help that they need. In a real sense, they're being marginalized and forgotten yet again. Also, it's important to note that the senseless crimes are symptoms of a larger societal problem. Asians are often targeted for acts of violence and hate because of stereotypes created and perpetuated in mainstream society. Only by educating the public and fighting against negative stereotypes can we have a permanent impact to reduce these types of incidents targeting Asian Americans. And that is why we're launching the National AAPI Crime Victims and Education Fund. The fund will provide financial assistance to AAPI crime victims anywhere in the country and to support educational and awareness programs aimed at reducing violence targeted towards the AAPI community. Many of you asked me and said, enough is enough. You want to support the victims, to support a permanent path going forward. With the backdrop of the tragic events here in Atlanta, we are taking a giant step to permanently end violence motivated by hate and bias against Asians. By supporting the National AAPI Crime Victims and Education Fund, please join us as we march toward a society where we all will be judged by the content of our character and not by the color of our skin, as envisioned by our Atlanta native, Dr. Martin Luther King. Thank you.
Thanks, BJay. And now we'll hear from Victoria Huynh.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, GAPABA and NCF and their steering committees for hosting this launch of the National AAPI Violence Prevention and Response Initiative. I'm Victoria Huynh with the Center for Pan-Asian Community Services right here in Atlanta, Georgia, a community-based organization that serves immigrants and refugees day in and day out for the past 40 years. You know, we thank everyone for hosting this conversation. I wish that we didn't have to meet under these difficult circumstances. And my heart is still with the victims of the March 16th shooting in Atlanta, as well as all the victims that are here with us today, and also the victims who suffered in the Boulder, Colorado attack. As a community-based center, we understand the importance of making sure that the programs and services are culturally and linguistically competent, especially in the time of crisis, and making sure our communities are able to gain access to health services, not only, after the attacks, but also as they rebuild their lives in the years to come. As we're looking at head of households being lost and how families are contributing to the income, having to decide how food and healthcare, transportation, childcare is going to be managed and supported. And we thank you for this opportunity to make sure that the funds get to the hands of our victims. We stand with local community-based organizations and direct service agencies that are on the ground in ensuring that this fund will make it to the communities. We support providers like Raksha, Gain, Tapestry, LAA, and not limited to just these organizations, but other providers that will be needed on the ground to help support the victims and the witnesses and the families impacted. We give thanks to Asian American Advancing Justice Atlanta, who've been leading the charge for collective action and helping us get to this point in ensuring that the funds will continue to go back to the victims. Unfortunately, we've seen too many situations where our communities have been impacted by violence. Our surviving victims and families are still living and fighting for justice for racially related attacks or gender-based violence, not only nationally, but here in the state of Georgia. We stand with our communities to ensure that these funds provide financial assistance to victims and support the amazing organizations already doing this work to uplift the victims and the families and communities that are still grieving today, tomorrow, and for years to come. And this funding will help victims and families and future, families that are being impacted, making sure that we help them gain access to vital language accesses, navigating health, rehab, social services, mental health services, gaining access to mental health services, supporting our families as they rebuild and figuring out, how to get away from media attention as their kids are still, going through all the pains of not having a family member around them. And as a steering committee member, we will continue to advocate for the victims and families and making sure that the victims are at the forefront. Their needs are at the forefront and at an afterthought, and making sure that as a partner and as a community organizer in this space, that we continue to keep the victims in our hearts as we build, as we make sure that the process of accessing these funds will not create any additional or unnecessary barriers for our communities. We thank you, GAPABA and NCF, and the future donors and the donors today for helping us support victims and witnesses, and ensuring that we continue to have these conversations around racial tensions, racial relations, and also making sure that we work on bias prevention work in the state of Georgia and other areas of the nation. Thank you, GAPABA and NCF.
Thank you very much.
Victoria.
Go ahead, Angela.
So my name is Angela Hsu, and I'm the president of the Georgia Asian Pacific American Bar Association, GAPABA. BJay and I started to talk about the idea of a permanent fund for victims of violent crime, of AAPI victims of violent crime. And we thought we would have months to kind of develop this idea. And then last week happened, and all of a sudden there was this incredible outpouring of people, of leaders all over our community, across the country, major corporations, bar leaders. Everyone is saying, what can we do? It's not just for these particular groups of victims. That was important to everyone, but also long-term, what can we do about racially motivated crimes against Asian Americans? And so, I'm here to answer the question of how this came about. Well, how this came about is that GAPABA, GLF, and CABA, these bar associations, have some of the most talented, passionate people I've ever had the pleasure of knowing. Just incredible talent. And then we have community leaders like Victoria of CPACS, but also AAJ, Raksha, We Love Buhai, Clarkston Free Medical Clinic. There's so many really amazing community partners in this Atlanta community that make things happen every day, that are on the ground in these communities helping people. So all these people are coming together, and then actually the National Compassion Fund found us, and we were impressed with their work. The testimony of these other victims will testify to that. So we have this moment. We have this moment where will, talent, passion, and resources are coalescing. And I think this is how we're going to get something permanent done. This is how we're going to make permanent change. So this is a 501c3, GLF's our 501c3 organization, and we, in the chat, we're putting in information about how to donate. But I really hope that everyone on this call and all the people that will be hopefully reading stories about this will coalesce with us, that we're kind of march together and really make a huge difference here.
Thank you so much, Angela. I'm sure some people are wondering, well, why do we need an fund for the Atlanta victims that's different from this other fund that Angela's talked about? And just as Angela said, we have a process that is ready to go right now and meet an immediate need. And the AAPI Crime Victims and Education Fund is going to be similar, but a little different in that it's not going to be just for one group of victims. It's going to be for many different victims across the country. And so there's going to be some different structure to that. And they're going to work on developing that, and we're going to offer our guidance and expertise based on our work with crime victims and what we've learned in this process but the Atlanta 316 victims can't wait. And so we're going to use our proven process that's ready to go now. And that process says that anyone can donate. We accept donations from through GoFundMe. You can also write a check or larger gifts might be done by other means. But 100% of that money will go to those victims. Because we're giving out 100% of that money, we're going to wait until we know how much money has been collected, and then we'll look at all of the victims that we have and come up with a plan to distribute all of that to those victims. The people who will be eligible will be the surviving family members of those who were killed, people who were physically injured, and also anyone who was on site and suffered psychological trauma as a result of this. Now, all of the details around this are going to be determined by a local steering committee that's made up of members, trusted members of the community, some of whom are on this call today. BJay is going to be the co-chair of that committee. And they will help make the policy decisions about how this is going to work. And then the National Compassion Fund will administer that based on their directions, and we will advise them given our experience. And so why should you trust the National Compassion Fund with your donation? Because we run a very transparent process. Once the steering committee is fully formed, they will approve what we call a draft protocol, which are their proposed rules for how this fund will operate. And then we're going to publish that draft protocol and invite public comment from anyone who's interested, survivors and their families, donors, anyone in the community. And we'll listen to all of those comments because collectively we'll come up with the best plan on how to help folks. And then once that public comment period is finished, the steering committee will determine, based on any of the feedback we've got, do we want to make any adjustments to the plan? Then a final plan will be published. And then we'll create our electronic application system. We'll work with law enforcement and medical providers and mental health professionals to validate these victims so that people know that we're giving money to the right folks. I always believe that's important so that donors can trust in our process, and because any dollar we give to someone who isn't the right person is money that we're taking away from the true victims and survivors. And so we take very seriously that charge to make sure we have a trusted and verifiable process. We also make sure that the gift that we give to those survivors is with no strings attached. Because we've learned that they know best what they need to heal. And so we don't make those decisions for them. And the way that people heal and respond are as unique as the individuals themselves. National Compassion Fund is a 501c3 nonprofit, so all of the donations to the Victims Fund are, of course, a charitable gift, which can be tax deductible. And so based on that, we'll have an open process, and we look forward to hearing and working with all of the members of our steering committee and the folks in Atlanta who want to help respond to the victims of this senseless atrocity. And now we'll hear from Edward Sohn.
Thank you, Jeff. I'll try not to repeat too much of what's been said. I'm honored to briefly just address that second fund that's been mentioned a couple times, the AAPI Crime and Education Fund. You know, BJay mentioned the skyrocketing levels of violence, the fear in living everyday lives, you know, even a specific instance of another survivor of a racially related shooting right here in this region, whose financial need just went unknown. It's incumbent on us to make an impact for the thousands of people across the country who even this minute are suffering from, you know, the impacts of anti-AAPI violence. You know, what we felt it was necessary was to just stand up in this moment, as Angela noted, and speak on behalf of those stories who remain unspoken, and to say to those survivors right now that are unseen and hidden away that we see you as well. And so this second fund is dedicated to that specific cause, you know, a permanent fund that will take the outpouring of support in this moment, as Angela noted, and extend the reach of those resources and to many others that are similarly situated. We hope that the existence of this Crime Victims Fund encourages reporting. As BJay mentioned, a lot of these crimes remain underreported without strong data. And as a result of this fund, we expect to increase that visibility. Also, as noted, it's insufficient to just resource people after an incident, although that's so crucial. We have to become opponents of the bias that animates that violence. And so this fund is dedicated to identifying, resourcing educational awareness programs. And together, we really hope to dismantle anti-API bias and its potentially lethal consequences. You know, one point that's just taken off of what Jeff was saying in terms of the administration, this Crime and Education Fund will be held by the GAPABA Law Foundation, a really respected group that I've been honored to serve with on the board for some time now. You know, we are attorneys, judges, and leaders that serve this community for a generation. We've always been humbled by the trust that so many have placed in us. Over $250,000 has been distributed through grants from the GAPABA Law Foundation over the years. And this group is among the most qualified to hold and select an administrator to distribute the fund in strict accordance with the fund goals. The existence of GAPABA Law Foundation since its inception has prepared us for a moment such as this. We'll perform our oversight duty with the utmost trust, transparency, and governance, as we always have, working together with a trusted, experienced partner like NCF with the right network and resources, as Jeff mentioned, really marshals the right resources and the right parties to do this, as we heard from some of the survivors, to really ensure that the support goes to where it's needed. You know, please join us. Sometimes money is what people can do, and as we've heard, it's really vitally needed here and elsewhere. So with that, I will hand it back.
Great, thank you very much. And now we'll hear from Timothy Wang.
Thanks, Jeff. My name is Timothy Wang. I have the privilege of serving as the president-elect of the Georgia Asian Pacific American Bar Association, and also as a board member of the GAPABA Law Foundation. First, thank you, Eric, Caren, Nikki, and Tiara for being here today and for your bravery and dedication to the cause of abolishing hate and violence in the world. There's a lot of evil in the world, and we unfortunately witnessed the worst of it here in Atlanta on March 16th when 8 people were murdered. But I do hope that from this tragedy, we are able to find some light. That in addition to helping the families of the victims, we're able to create a permanent memorial to the 8 innocent people who lost their lives, 6 of whom were Asian. A permanent fund that will help to reverse the tide of hate, bigotry, bias, and violence against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And in so doing, help to reverse the tide of hate, bigotry, bias, and violence against all people. In a letter from a Birmingham jail cell, Dr. King wrote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." There is so much power and truth in those words. There's no question that we are all connected as people, as co-workers, as neighbors, as friends, and certainly as Americans. And as Americans, we cannot let hate and violence, racism and prejudice to continue. And as many have said on this call, we cannot stand on the sidelines. We cannot simply condemn the hate and the violence and the racism. We must take action. We have to learn from the mistakes of the past so that history does not repeat itself. We have to speak anywhere and anytime that we see injustice. And we have to defend those who cannot defend themselves. I truly believe that we're at a turning point in this country. The blinders are off. Whatever myths that were perpetrated before to divide us are crumbling. We are united by the unwavering belief that there is strength in numbers and that a rising tide lifts all ships. I believe that this is a historic moment, and that 100 years from now, when people remember these weeks and these past months, it won't simply be about COVID or George Floyd or the March 16th Atlanta tragedy. but rather they'll remember these weeks and these past months as a time when the AAPI community, the Black community, the Latinx community, the white community, when all communities said, enough is enough. A time when all communities united and came together to take a stand against injustice and embrace Dr. King's words, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I hope that people will join us in taking action. The first step of many is the creation of the funds that were discussed today and the launch of the initiative. Those funds are currently open, and contributions, as people have said, can be made. Please go to GoFundMe, go to NCF's website, which is the nationalcompassionfund.org, go to GAPABA.org. We'll make it easy for you to find the way to give, but you need to take action. We hope you stand with us. We thank you.
Thank you so much, Timothy. We're happy to answer questions, and you can type your questions in the Q&A box. We do have our first question. What are the other ways that the legal community can help combat the surge in race-based crimes and discrimination that's pervasive in the industry? I know that Kiara wanted to answer that, and then we'll hear from Ed after that. Kiara?
Yes, when I saw the question when it first came up, and I have to say, I think it starts with education. If we're not educating our people, it's going to be one of those things where the legal community can't do so much because it starts with us. I think it comes with educating our people educating each other, us taking that step to really make it known that this is not the cause of one group of people or several different groups of people. We're not singling them out. So the level of education, in order for the legal community to take any kind of action with trying to stop the surge in these types of hate crimes or hate massacres or anything of that sort, we're going to have to start educating our people. And that's the biggest thing. That's the only way that this would work, because it starts with us before anybody in the legal community can step in and do it.
Yeah, and I think I'll just add on top of that, there are opportunities for legal advocacy, for legal defense, and there are resources that are available for that, and it's different in different places. So, we encourage that people can find ways to do that, to provide, pro bono services where needed. In terms of funding, I think, the money that's needed so desperately in these moments and moments like these that are happening unseen everywhere, lawyers are frequently well positioned to marshal those resources and to marshal influence, across organizations and communities to bring the right attention. And then, Tiara mentioned education. That's the first thing, which I think is really telling, hearing that from a survivor. And it's the last thing I'll say here. I think it's the biggest thing as well. Thinking through this, having vocabulary and knowledge, really helping the community do homework on the right way to respond to these things, the right way to help, the right way to provide action. That's what I've learned here today. I think listening from everyone here is just underlining the need for those funds to reach the right people and to do that with great transparency, that's not just administrative or operational. It's critical, in terms of the way that every person can connect, their act of volition and their will to actually contribute to the fight that we're fighting here. And so I think doing that homework and parsing through that, having that awareness and education on the issue and what helps in moments like this, I think is a critical thing that the legal community can do.
Great, thanks, Ed. We've had another question that asks, when are funds expected to be dispersed to the Atlanta victims? We're going to shortly publish a proposed timeline, but as I said, we give out 100% of the money. And so what that means is we wait until we see how much money we have, and then how do we divide it among those survivors. Our experience has been that oftentimes corporations will make the largest donations, but corporations also take the longest to give. And so it's a question of balancing. We want to keep the fund open for donations long enough to capture those donations. And so usually we're holding donations open for at least a few months. And then once we see how much money we have, we'll be able to distribute it. And it's also a question of trying to balance the needs of victims, about getting money to them as soon as we can to help, But what we've heard from survivors is, if I had to face this process 2 weeks after the event, I just would not have been ready. And so we're preparing for that process to work with victims. And in the meantime, there are other local partners that are providing emergency assistance. So we're really set up as sort of a medium-term solution, but one that maximizes the benefit to victims and works to capture as many resources as possible to help them. All right. Are there any other questions? If not, then we'll simply ask people to stay tuned. If anybody wants to be updated about what's going on with the Atlanta 316 Fund and get those regular updates, if you go to nationalcompassionfund.org, there's a victim survivor contact form. So whether someone is a family member, a victim, a donor, or just a concerned citizen, if they put their information, submit their information and that link on our website, then we will send out information that's just specific to the Atlanta 316 Survivors Fund, so you can stay informed about that process as we move along. Everyone's talked about in the aftermath of one of these crimes, everyone says, what can we do? And what you can do is give. And I see that we need to update the website. It's set and ready to go, but we were very concerned about launching before we started this this press conference. And so I'll give them the word that that site can now go live. So thank you everybody for your time and attention. Thank you to the survivors for sharing your story. We start with you because that's the reason we're here. And thank you so much to the leaders of the AAPI legal community for seeing this opportunity and using your resources and connections to make a real positive difference. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.